What does All Might stand for? Well, he's the symbol of peace, that's what everyone says. But a good amount of tension that emerges from that rhetoric is that a lot of blood is shed in its name. Despite All Might being a symbol of peace, there's a lot of chaos that comes in the name of peace. And in the manga, this is happening right now. After this absolutely tumultuous fight, we find a passing of the torch. In the process of doing so, we find the ominous words about how the symbol of peace is dead, or rather, gone. The bureaucrats worry that without their symbol of peace, the society would feel directionless and things would get dangerous. And that's really interesting. Because My Hero Academia is an incredibly interesting piece of superhero fiction because of the intercontinental influences that come with it. See, juxtaposed with the visuals of a contemporary Japan is the sensibility that is reminiscent of the Silver Age of comic books, the time when superheroes adopted increasingly idealistic behaviors, when they were finally cleaved from their World War II rhetoric and before the drug-filled or increasingly PSAs of the Bronze Age. This Silver Age was the age of ideas, ideals, and oftentimes how they challenged one another. And you can find a little bit of the Silver Age in All Might. The vivid stylization of his costume, the hammy dialogue, the sheer optimism that nevertheless belies an identity of frustration, something that Dan Hassler-Forrest notes is part of the appeal of the Silver Age comics, that youth senses of being marginalized and misunderstood by the world around them resonated several heroes of the Silver Age with an increasingly fluid youth identity. And it's even more important when you consider that a huge factor for the birth of the Silver Age came from Frederick Wertham's infamous book, Seduction of the Innocent, which shifted blame on youth crime from socioeconomic factors to comic books. As a result, there was a sort of explosion of characterization that ultimately ended up defining a lot of elements of many superheroes we see today. People with weaknesses, not just fictional manifestations. There are fluctuations of the cocksure, clever, and the powerful, to the vulnerable, the weak, and the untrusted. And in many ways, All Might continues that tradition. He draws upon the senses of the superhuman as someone that, despite their intentions and their bombastic presentation, is nevertheless someone that faces huge personal struggles, a sense of powerlessness beneath the facade of the powerful, that even in his attempt to teach what he knows about being a superhero to Izuku, there's this fallibility to him as he sends Izuku off to another teacher, or when he's constantly beset by his own failures, such as when Recovery Girl lectures him on the dangerousness of the quirk One for All. This is a juxtaposition between the strong and the weak, and how they share the same identity. But there was also something else that All Might brought over. Something a bit more abstract. Peace. But at the same time, it wasn't peace per se, it was what peace stood for, or more precisely, what it was conceptually. See, intertwined in peace is its role as a guiding and connecting figure throughout the story. As a symbol of peace, All Might acts as the force upon which several villains framed themselves against, and the act of trying to take him down is itself a highly symbolic endeavor. After all, Shigaraki's goal to kill All Might and usher in an age without the symbol of peace is an exercise that asks a very important question. If he succeeds, where do we go from there? And how My Hero Academia attempts to answer that question is still unfurling and constantly in flux, and I think that is, in some roundabout way, its answer. Because what matters isn't peace per se, but how peace as an idea or a concept leads and guides the story of the plot. Its concept comes from challenges or reconceptualizations of peace. All Might stands for peace, and thus must be taken down. Conversely, All Might stands for peace and must be cropped up. Later on, the rogue Stain, for instance, acts as an attempt to reconceptualize the various ideas that come with peace, and Stain himself is a contrast to Shigaraki, who begins as a counterbalance to All Might's peace by attempting to kill him and thus destroy it. And if you remove peace itself, not the concept, but the word, the vagueness of their doctrines can be interchanged with almost anything superhero related, and realistically it would only make a marginal difference. What's valuable isn't peace itself, but that something symbolic for a social order, something like peace, exists. If you're familiar with the works of Jean-François Lyotard, you may be familiar with the metanarrative, something that abstracts localized stories together into not just a theme, but a forwarding element, an explanatory framework whereupon our knowledge of what's happening or is going to happen can be charted. The metanarrative is the big story, the worldview story, the force that is not only an impetus upon which human history can be charted and understood, but also in which it may be challenged. And for My Hero Academia, it seems like peace is one such meta-narrative, but not necessarily peace as a thing, but rather that peace is progressive, peace is good, and that the elimination of peace through a top-down system that actively punishes challenges to social orders, that's the meta-narrative it posits. So it's sort of a universal pacifism, I would say, and that's what I mean by peace as a meta-narrative. Everything happens in the name of peace, everything can only happen because of peace, and everything that's a challenge is a challenge to peace itself. Of course, it's probably not as encompassing as we'd consider modern meta-narratives, but it's so vast in the context of the story that if we slightly broaden the requirements, it certainly fits as one. The festival can only occur because of the peace All Might and the heroes brought. The heroes themselves work to advance not an ideology per se, but a harmonious society. Shigaraki's goal is to destabilize that peace. The worries of the bureaucrats after All Might's form is revealed is that their peace will end alongside it. And when we get to Stain, he admonishes Shigaraki for his lack of what Stain calls a creed. Because since Shigaraki is to end the meta-narrative of peace itself, and Stain admires All Might for his creed, Stain's position as how he's framed as a thinking, charismatic, and sometimes empathetic villain essentially asks the question as to what role does the meta-narrative play in the broader story of My Hero Academia? After all, is a meta-narrative necessary? This question is incredibly important because of Japan's status as what scholars call the postmodern society. A major element of the postmodern condition is what Lyotard calls an incredulity towards meta-narratives. In short, what legitimizes the narrative patterns of history are losing its monolithic cohesion. That, as he famously puts, the narrative is losing its functors, its great hero, its great dangers, its great voyages, its great goal. In fact, you're probably familiar with the collapse of the world's last great meta-narrative, communism. And for Japan, that matters. See, Azuma Hiroki and Osawa Masaji are both scholars who note that between the 60s and 70s, Japan's great meta-narrative was arguably idealism, something that you can see in its riotous history and movements. However, starting from the 70s, it became increasingly postmodern. While we could argue that fictive escape in the 70s and 80s would only make the society partially postmodern, Hiroki nevertheless notes the 90s as a time period where that partiality becomes totality. And this is where My Hero Academia and peace matter. All Might's position as a symbol of peace is an exercise in trying to understand the role of a grand narrative in a society that's used to a postmodern one. More importantly, I think it makes a statement on Japan's own postmodernism, because even though All Might's peace is no longer there is another potential meta-narrative emerging. And that, I think, is continuity. Now, normally we wouldn't consider continuity to be a meta-narrative simply because its mere existence is effective as an explanatory framework, but there is a passing of the torch element to My Hero Academia that does suggest that it might become the new worldview. Aside from the obvious one-for-all quirk, there's a surprising amount of diachronic familial or familial-esque relationships. Tenya's revenge is driven by Stain crippling his brother. Shoto's identity is driven by his disdain for his father. Toshinori, All Might's alter ego, has troubles as to what he should do after finding out Shigaraki's relationship to his former mentor. And the academia itself, while not familial, is nevertheless a clear passing of the torch that, for a story based around a school of heroes, we find little education and much more of a growth that revolves around problems that come from that academy. In other words, the next generation learns by working in tandem with the previous generation. And this is really important because, as I've stated in my Akira video, this continuity defines a lot of postmodern Japanese identities. Broadly speaking, the existence of an alternative or at least emerging meta-narrative is really important for anime because this postmodern condition is actually questioned quite a bit. And the most notable meta-narrative you'll probably find is nationalism. Gate, for instance, provides a somewhat of a malformed meta-narrative that asks, where do we go after we've conquered the gate and had our justice? What drives us? What defines us? And to some degree, it's the post-war nationalistic democratic identity that Gate foregrounds as a sort of weak meta-narrative. But whether it's fully formed is something that's really up to you, the eye of the beholder. Nevertheless, superheroes are oftentimes studied for what they stand for, as their positions and their natures oftentimes reflect bygone or emerging local stories that could blossom into potential meta-narratives. And for that reason, studying All Might and what he stands for is important. Its argument isn't so much that peace itself is the central factor, but that some intertwining function exists in the first place, that some order or driving force guides these people, or at least we have a way to explain what's happening in a broad scale. We have to bleed or have bled for something, because I think the most terrifying element is when you've bled for nothing. Like the heroes of the story, with the downfall of one meta-narrative, it earnestly grooms another. And in this context, My Hero Academia is a surprisingly modernist piece that emerged from a very postmodernist society. So going back to the question I asked before, what does All Might stand for? Well, I think the answer is it really doesn't matter. Rather, what matters is that there was something to stand for in the first place.